On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, one of the busiest travel days in the American calendar, a man in a black business suit walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter at Portland International Airport and paid $20 cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. The ticket agent did not ask for identification because in 1971, domestic airline tickets required no identification whatsoever. You walked up, you paid, you boarded. 36 other passengers boarded Flight 305 that afternoon under the same casual conditions, their names, if given at all, taken on faith, checked against nothing. It was a different world in almost every measurable sense. The Boeing 727 running the Portland to Seattle route was an unremarkable commuter aircraft on one of the shortest commercial hops in the American domestic network. 30 minutes in the air, a routine trip that business people and regular travelers did so often, it barely registered as an event. The crew had done this run dozens of times. The passengers had packed light for a short trip and were thinking about Thanksgiving plans. Nobody was thinking about what the man in seat 18E was thinking about. Dan Cooper settled into his aisle seat at the rear of the aircraft, in the last row, near the tail. He ordered a bourbon and soda from a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. He lit a cigarette. He sat quietly, looking out toward the dark grey sky of a November afternoon in the Pacific Northwest, as the jet taxied and lifted and banked south over the city of Portland, and then turned north towards Seattle. He was dressed in a dark business suit, a white shirt, a narrow black tie, a clip-on, as it turned out, not a real tie, the kind of tie that cost $1 and left no impression. He wore a black overcoat. He wore loafers. He carried an attaché case. He looked like a businessman taking a commuter flight, which was exactly what every other person on that aircraft looked like, which was presumably the point. He was in his mid-40s, or seemed to be, medium height, 5'10", maybe 6 feet, 170 pounds, give or take. Dark hair, dark eyes, olive complexion. He spoke clearly and without apparent regional accent, though some of the crew would later describe something that might have been a Midwest cadence, something that suggested the northern plains rather than the coasts. He was calm in the specific way that people are calm when their mind is somewhere else, running through a sequence of events that has been planned and that is now beginning. About 15 minutes after takeoff, he passed a note to Florence Schaffner. She assumed it was a phone number. Men passed flight attendants' notes in 1971, particularly on short hops where there was barely time for a drink, let alone a conversation, and Florence tucked the note into her pocket without reading it. He leaned toward her, quietly enough that no other passenger could hear, and said, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She took the note out and read it. Written in capital letters, it said, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." Florence kept her composure. She was a flight attendant in an era when flight attendants were trained for this, when aircraft hijackings were common enough that there was a procedure, when the protocol was to stay calm and follow instructions and not escalate. She went and found Tina Mucklow, the youngest member of the crew, 22 years old, fresh to the job. And Tina came and sat down in the seat beside the man who had passed the note. He opened his briefcase for her. She looked inside and saw what she later described as a battery, colored wires and red cylinders. Whether it was a real bomb is a question that has never been definitively answered. Investigators who examined the case afterward concluded that the device was likely a fake, a convincing prop, because Cooper would have known that blowing up the aircraft would defeat the entire purpose of the exercise. But Tina Mucklow, sitting in seat 18E on a Boeing 727 15,000 feet over the Pacific Northwest on the afternoon of November 24, 1971, did not know this. She saw what appeared to be an explosive device, and she behaved accordingly. He closed the briefcase. He told her what he wanted. $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve, a fuel truck standing by when the plane landed in Seattle. And when he had all of that, the aircraft would take off again and fly south toward Mexico City. He also said, if the plane attempted to land before his conditions were met, or if anything was brought aboard that he had not requested, he would detonate the bomb. Tina Mucklow went to the cockpit and relayed his demands. Captain William Scott relayed them to Seattle Air Traffic Control. Air Traffic Control relayed them to Northwest Orient's corporate offices. Northwest Orient's president, sitting in a conference room somewhere in Minneapolis, faced a decision that no protocol had quite prepared him for. A quiet, apparently reasonable man, 30,000 feet in the air, was claiming to have a bomb and was asking for a number that was large but not unmanageable. The president made the decision that most airline executives in that era made when faced with hijackings, which was to comply and trust that the FBI could sort it out on the ground. He authorized the payment. The plane circled Puget Sound for nearly 2 hours, while Seattle area banks assembled $200,000 in $20 bills. The bills were not marked in the traditional sense, no die packs, no tracking devices, but every serial number was photographed before the money was packaged. 10,000 $20 bills, their numbers recorded, put into a canvas bag and driven to the airport. 4 parachutes were also assembled. 2 of them were civilian sport parachutes of the type used by experienced skydivers, steerable, controllable, designed for accuracy. 2 were military-issue round canopies, the kind used in military drops, functional but not steerable, landing wherever the wind carried them. And one of the reserve parachutes provided was a training dummy, a chute sewn shut, non-deployable, used for practicing harness procedures on the ground. It was either a mistake or a gambit, and nobody from the ground team who assembled the equipment ever provided a definitive explanation for how it ended up in the package. Nobody told Cooper. What happened on Flight 305 between Seattle and the point somewhere over southwest Washington, where D.B. Cooper stepped out of a Boeing 727 and into the night, is one of the most scrutinized and analyzed half-hours in the history of American criminal investigation. At 5:39 in the afternoon, Flight 305 landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport and taxied to an isolated position away from the main terminal. A Northwest Orient employee brought the money, packed in a canvas bag, and the parachutes to the aircraft. Cooper inspected the money. Tina Mucklow watched him count through the bills, checking them in the specific way of someone who has thought about what 20,000 $20 bills looks like and is confirming that what he sees matches what he imagined. He told her to let 35 of the 36 passengers go. He kept the crew. The passengers deplaned onto the tarmac without knowing fully what had happened. The airline had told them there was a mechanical difficulty. Some had figured out from the circling and the delay that something was wrong. None of them were hurt. They were escorted into the terminal while, on the isolated section of tarmac, the man in seat 18E prepared for the second part of the evening. The meals had been brought on board during the stop. Cooper, reportedly, had asked that the crew be allowed to eat. Tina Mucklow, who sat with him through the long wait, later noted that he had offered her money from the ransom, a handful of bills, extended toward her in a gesture that she found difficult to categorize, somewhere between a tip and something stranger. She declined politely. He accepted her refusal without any change in his manner. Captain Scott was told the conditions for the second flight, south toward Mexico City, below 10,000 feet, landing gear down, flaps at 15 degrees, maximum airspeed of 150 knots. The slower the plane flew, the lower it flew, the better the conditions for a parachute jump. Scott knew what the instructions meant. He complied. At approximately 7:40 in the evening, Flight 305 lifted off from Seattle-Tacoma Airport for the second time that day and turned south. Fighter jets were scrambled to follow at a distance, flying high and fast and unable to observe closely. The cabin lights were on inside, per Cooper's instructions, which meant that anyone looking in from outside, from the military jets, from the ground, could potentially see shapes moving inside the aircraft, but could not see clearly. He told Tina Mucklow to go join the rest of the crew in the cockpit. She was the last person to see him. The crew complied with his instructions. Altitude, speed, flaps, everything as specified. Military jets followed at a distance, too high and too fast to observe in detail. The cockpit voice recorder was running. At some point, the crew felt a change in pressure at the rear of the aircraft, a lurch that Captain Scott described afterward as the sensation of the aft staircase deploying. The Boeing 727 was one of the very few commercial aircraft in operation at that time, with a staircase built into the tail, opening downward from the rear of the plane, that could be operated from inside the cabin, without any input from the cockpit. It was a feature unique to the 727 in its configuration, designed for boarding at airports without jetways, and it was the feature that Cooper had specifically and casually asked about when he bought his ticket in Portland, whether Flight 305 was operated by a 727 equipped with rear stairs. The ticket agent had confirmed it without any particular reaction because it was an ordinary question about equipment. He had known before he boarded exactly how he was going to leave. At 8:13 p.m., the tail of the aircraft lurched again, a pressure change consistent with a decrease in weight at the rear of the plane. The crew noted it. They did not know what it meant in the moment. They flew on toward Reno, where they had been told to refuel and where they landed without incident sometime after 9 in the evening. When the ground crew opened the aircraft, one of the 4 parachutes was gone. The aft staircase was deployed, hanging down from the tail of the aircraft into the night air. The money bag was gone. The man who had given his name as Dan Cooper was not on the aircraft. He was not found on the tarmac. He was not found in the airport. He was not found that night anywhere or the next day or in any of the 53 years since. The FBI knew within hours that they were dealing with something unprecedented. The agency launched NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking, immediately, and it became one of the most resource-intensive investigations in Bureau history. The initial physical evidence was limited in the extreme. Cigarette butts from seat 18E, a black clip-on tie left on the seat, a few cocktail napkins, and the parachute equipment Cooper had not taken with him. He had not left fingerprints, or none that could be isolated from the dozens of other passengers who had touched the same surfaces. The seat had been touched by hundreds of people over hundreds of flights. The clip-on tie was analyzed extensively. It was a J.C. Penney tie, cheap and ordinary, the kind that could be bought at any department store in America. Forensic examination of the tie found microscopic particles, trace elements of titanium, stainless steel, bismuth, and aluminum. One analysis conducted by a forensic scientist named Tom Kay, who became deeply involved in the case years later, suggested that the particle profile might indicate someone who worked in a manufacturing environment, possibly aerospace or metals. A profile consistent with the Pacific Northwest's industrial economy of the early 1970s. The physical description, built from the accounts of the crew, was consistent across sources. White male, mid-40s, approximately 5 feet 10 to 6 feet tall, 170 to 180 pounds, olive complexion, dark eyes, dark hair cut conventionally and parted on the left side. Well-dressed in an unremarkable way. Clear voice. No particular regional accent that the crew could identify with certainty, though Tina Mucklow described something that might have been a Midwest cadence. A composite sketch was drawn and released. It showed a square-jawed, nondescript middle-aged man who could have been any of 10 million American men. It was accurate, presumably, as far as it went. It was also essentially useless as a means of narrowing a population. The search for the landing zone began immediately. Investigators calculated the approximate position of the aircraft at the moment of the pressure change, somewhere over the drainage between the Lewis River and the Washougal River in southwest Washington, based on the flight path and the time. They applied what they knew about wind conditions that night: cloudy, raining, temperatures in the mid-30s, wind at approximately 32 miles per hour. They produced an estimated landing area: densely forested terrain, rough and irregular, no roads, cold and wet in the specific way of Pacific Northwest November nights. Ground teams went in. Search aircraft swept the area. Nothing was found. No body, no parachute, no equipment, no clothing, no evidence whatsoever of a man having landed in those woods. The FBI widened the search. Over the following months, thousands of square miles of forest were searched in various ways, with various levels of coverage. The forests of southwest Washington are not wilderness in the dramatic sense. They are logged and camped and hiked and driven through. They are not impossible to search, and yet the search produced nothing, which investigators interpreted in different ways. Either Cooper had not landed in the estimated zone, or Cooper had died and the body had decomposed beyond detection, or Cooper had survived and had walked out before anyone knew to look for him. The Boeing 727 had a feature that Cooper had identified and planned for. It had a flaw, from an operational security standpoint, that he had either not identified or had decided to accept: the parachutes. He had requested 4, 2 primary and 2 reserve. What was provided was a mixture of civilian sport parachutes and military-issue equipment. The critical choice, the one that investigators would analyze for decades, was which of the available parachutes he took with him when he jumped. The civilian sport parachute in the package was a square canopy, steerable, controllable, designed so that an experienced jumper could aim for a specific landing zone and hit it with reasonable precision. This was the parachute that any trained skydiver who had thought carefully about a night jump over unfamiliar terrain would have chosen. It was the parachute that gave you some control over where you ended up. Cooper left it behind. He took a military-issue round canopy, functional, reliable, but unsteerable. Once deployed, a round canopy goes where the wind takes it. You can do small things with your body position to influence your drift, but you cannot aim. You land wherever the wind decides to put you, and in the Lewis River drainage on the night of November 24, 1971, the wind was gusting up to 32 miles per hour in an area of dense, unpredictable forest. This choice became one of the defining arguments in the debate about Cooper's identity and experience level. FBI Special Agent Larry Carr, who revived the investigation in 2007 and became its most public face in the case's later years, stated plainly, "No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch-black night, in the rain, with a 200-mile-an-hour wind in his face, wearing loafers and a trench coat." The clothing was its own argument. A man who had planned this carefully enough to know the exact model of aircraft to book his ticket on, who had specified the altitude and the speed and the flap setting for the second flight, who had thought through the escape in enough operational detail to ask the right questions at the ticket counter. That man had not brought cold weather gear, had not brought boots, had not worn anything under his business suit that would help him survive a landing in a Pacific Northwest forest in late November. If he had planned to survive, the planning was incomplete. If he had not planned to survive, if this was a spectacular exit rather than a calculated escape, then the choices made more sense. Or he was simply not a skilled parachutist, had acquired just enough knowledge to execute the jump, but not enough to execute it well. and the forest and the night and the November cold did the rest. The FBI's working theory, stated publicly when the case was moved to inactive status in 2016, was that Cooper died. That he had jumped into terrain and conditions that he was not equipped to survive. That his body decomposed in the forest over the following winter, and that the only physical evidence that reached the outside world, the deteriorating bills found in the sand at Tena Bar, represented the slow migration of a portion of the ransom through the watershed system from wherever he landed to where an 8-year-old boy found them 9 years later. November 1971 was not, it should be noted, a particularly unusual month for aircraft hijackings. The era between 1968 and 1973 had been so prolific in skyjackings that historians called it the golden age of hijacking, a period in which over 300 aircraft were seized worldwide, when "Fly Me to Cuba" became a cultural reference, when the idea of a hijacking produced not panic, but a kind of bored resignation among frequent travelers who had heard this story before. In 1971 alone, before Cooper's flight, there had been numerous hijackings of American aircraft, most of them demands for transit to a specific location or political statements of one kind or another. What made Cooper's hijacking different, what made it singular in the 50-plus years of cases that followed, was the exit. Nobody else had jumped. Every other hijacker had landed with the plane and been arrested on the ground, or had negotiated a release, or had been shot. The idea of using a commercial aircraft as a platform for a parachute escape had not been attempted, and it worked, or appeared to work, with a completeness that no investigator or aviation authority had prepared for. After November 24, 1971, the Federal Aviation Administration required a modification to be installed on all Boeing 727 aircraft that prevented the aft staircase from being lowered while in flight. The device was a simple mechanical lock operated from the cockpit. It was named the Cooper vane. That detail, a specific piece of aeronautical hardware that exists because of one man's escape, that bears the name the press gave him rather than the name he gave himself, is perhaps the most concrete trace he left on the world. Not a name, not a body, not a parachute. A small mechanical component on the tail of every 727 that flew after 1972, locking a door that one man had used and nobody has used since. The suspects accumulated over the decades of the investigation in a way that itself became a kind of phenomenon. The FBI formally considered more than 1,000 individuals. Amateur researchers, of whom there were many, considered thousands more. The case attracted the specific kind of sustained civilian attention that unsolved mysteries attract. The people who become genuinely obsessed, who spend years building files and running down leads and attending conferences and corresponding with each other about the meaning of microscopic particles on a cheap necktie. Among the suspects who received serious attention, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. hijacked a United Airlines flight in April of 1972, 5 months after Cooper's escape, in what was so clearly a Cooper imitation that investigators seriously considered whether McCoy and Cooper were the same person. McCoy was a Vietnam veteran, a trained parachutist, a Sunday school teacher in Utah. He jumped from the hijacked aircraft, landed successfully. He was, unlike the possible Cooper, an experienced jumper, and was arrested within days. The flight attendants from Flight 305 were shown his photograph. They did not recognize him. His physical description was inconsistent with the Cooper composite in specific ways. McCoy was convicted and sentenced, escaped from federal prison, and was shot and killed in a confrontation with FBI agents in 1974. Kenneth Christiansen was a former Northwest Orient employee, a man who had worked as a parachute rigger in the military, had been hired by the airline, and had spent his career handling aircraft and equipment. He died in 1994. Near the end of his life, he had called his brother Lyle to him and said something that Lyle spent the subsequent years trying to understand. "There is something you should know. but I cannot tell you. The specific quality of that statement, the acknowledgement that there was something, the refusal to name it, became the foundation of an investigation that Lyle and a journalist named Skip Porteous conducted over many years. Former flight attendant Florence Schaffner, one of the two primary eyewitnesses, was shown Christiansen's photograph and said she saw similarities. The FBI evaluated the evidence and noted that Christiansen's height, weight, and eye color were inconsistent with the descriptions given on the night of the hijacking. Dwayne Webber called his wife Jo from a Florida hospital bed in 1995, dying of kidney failure, and said, "I have a secret to tell you. I'm Dan Cooper." He died before he could say anything further. Jo Weber spent the following years investigating her late husband's past, finding details she considered relevant. A trip to the Portland area, knowledge of the Columbia River, a scar she thought might be consistent with a rough parachute landing. She brought what she had to the FBI. They evaluated it and could not confirm or eliminate Weber as a suspect. The deathbed confessions, of which there were multiple over the years, followed a consistent pattern. A dying person in the specific emotional state of a man or woman who wants to leave something behind, claims to be or to have known D.B. Cooper. The FBI evaluated each one and found none credible. The case attracted people who wanted to be part of it, and the deathbed confession was one way of achieving that association at minimal personal cost. The case produced suspects at a rate that made it difficult to manage. Over 45 years of active investigation, investigators identified and assessed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 individuals as possible candidates. Most were eliminated quickly. A handful resisted elimination and remained subjects of active interest for years or decades. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was the closest thing to a confirmed copycat. 5 months after the Cooper hijacking in April of 1972, McCoy executed a nearly identical crime. Hijacked a United Airlines flight, demanded a parachute and a large sum of money, jumped from the aircraft, and was caught. He was a Vietnam veteran, a trained parachutist, and he had done it so similarly to Cooper that investigators seriously considered whether McCoy and Cooper were the same person. He was ruled out. The flight attendants who had spent hours with Cooper in November 1971 did not recognize McCoy. His physical description didn't match. McCoy was later killed in a shootout with law enforcement after escaping from prison. Kenneth Christensen was a former Northwest Orient employee who had worked as a parachute rigger in the military. He died in 1994. His brother Lyle reported that Kenneth, near the end of his life, had called him close and said, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." The brothers' subsequent investigation produced circumstantial connections to the Cooper case. Former Northwest flight attendant Florence Schaffner, one of the two primary eyewitnesses, was shown Christiansen's photograph and said she saw similarities. The FBI noted that Christiansen's height, weight, and eye color did not match the flight attendant's description. Dwayne Webber told his wife Jo from his deathbed in a Florida hospital in 1995, "I have a secret to tell you. I'm Dan Cooper." He died before he could say more. Jo spent the following years investigating her late husband's past, finding details that she considered significant. The FBI evaluated the evidence she brought them and found it insufficient to make a determination. Multiple deathbed confessions were received over the years. None were considered credible. On February 10, 1980, 8 years, 2 months, and 17 days after the hijacking, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a camping trip with his family at a location called Tina Bar, on the Washington side of the Columbia River, about 9 miles northwest of Vancouver. It was a Sunday. He was helping prepare a campfire by smoothing the sandy bank when his hands found something buried just below the surface, 3 bundles of deteriorating $20 bills, still loosely bound by rubber bands that had survived 8 years in the water and sand. The bills were waterlogged and crumbling at the edges, their faces barely legible. There were 294 of them. Total value, $5,880. His parents contacted the police. The police contacted the FBI. An agent asked Brian's father to read one of the serial numbers aloud over the phone, while another agent checked it against the master list that had been created when the ransom was assembled in Seattle in November of 1971. It matched. For the first time since the night of the hijacking, a physical trace of D.B. Cooper had been found outside an aircraft. It was roughly 3% of the total ransom, an amount small enough to raise more questions than it answered. Where was the other $97,000? Why had only this small portion surfaced, and only here, and only now? Forensic analysis of the bills produced a significant finding. Microscopic algae found on the money was analyzed by specialists who determined that it was consistent with the biology of the following spring and summer, not the autumn of 1971. This meant the bills had not been submerged in November. They had been somewhere else first, and had only entered the water system months after the hijacking. Whether that somewhere else was a cache that Cooper had made before he died, or before he left the area, or a location where his body and the money had lain over the winter before spring runoff carried the money into a tributary, that question was never resolved. The discovery produced the most intensive period of investigation since the initial search. Investigators returned to the Columbia River watershed with new focus. Maps were redrawn. The estimated landing zone was recalculated using the Tina Bar location as a data point, working backward through the watershed to determine where the bills might have originated. The analysis suggested that the money's path to Tina Bar could be traced to the Washougal River drainage, which was consistent with some estimates of Cooper's jump zone, but not all of them. The rest of the money, $194,120, has never been found. Not in the river, not in the forest, not in a bank account, not in anyone's possession. Not one additional bill has surfaced in 53 years. Brian Ingram, who found the bills as an 8-year-old on a camping trip, grew up to be a man who sold some of them at auction because they had become valuable as artifacts, as the only confirmed physical evidence from the most famous unsolved hijacking in history. He kept others. He gave interviews. He did not know where D.B. Cooper was, and neither did anyone else. The FBI kept Norjak open for 45 years. In July of 2016, after reviewing the status of the investigation, the Bureau officially moved the case to inactive status. The announcement was careful in its wording. The case was not closed, it was suspended. If new, credible physical evidence emerged, it would be investigated. The decision to suspend was framed as a resource allocation matter. Investigators were needed for active terrorism and national security threats, and Norjak had not produced a viable lead in years. The reaction to the suspension was immediate and significant. The community of Cooper enthusiasts, a group that by 2016 had grown over 45 years into something with its own conferences, its own publications, its own internal debates about suspects and evidence and methodology, treated the announcement as both a disappointment and, in some ways, a vindication of their relevance. If the FBI was stepping back, the amateur investigators were not. The case continued in the hands of people who had been working it for years on their own time, and continues in those hands today. Ralph Himmelsbach, the FBI agent who had been first on the case in 1971 and who had named it Norjak, spent years investigating Cooper and wrote a book about it. He was convinced Cooper died in the jump. "The guy was an idiot," he said in one interview, without apparent apology for the characterization. He jumped in the dark, in the rain, in a business suit, in November. He's dead. The only question is where. Larry Carr, the agent who revived the investigation in the 2000s and became its most accessible public face, agreed that Cooper almost certainly died. He was less certain about the idiot characterization. Cooper had, after all, executed a crime with enough precision that it had never been solved. The question of whether the jump was planned as a suicide or as an escape that went badly was, Carr acknowledged, one that the evidence did not definitively answer. Tom Kay, the forensic scientist who analyzed the tie in detail and found the particle profile that suggested an industrial manufacturing background, remained skeptical of the death theory for a different reason. The forest in the estimated landing zone was not wilderness. It was logged, camped, hiked, hunted. People moved through it regularly. Typically, they find the bodies of people who go missing in that part of the forest, he noted. The absence of a body in an area where missing persons were generally recovered was evidence of something, though what, exactly, it was evidence of was itself contested. The name D.B. Cooper, not the name he used, which was Dan Cooper, came from a journalist error. When the United Press International Wire Service first moved the story on the night of the hijacking, a reporter misidentified the name as D.B. Cooper. The FBI corrected the error the following day. By then, it had traveled around the world, and the correction had not. D.B. Cooper was who the public knew, and who the public continued to know, and the name with the initials somehow fit the mystery better than the name without them, as if the unknown middle name was itself the answer that nobody had. Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant who spent more time with Cooper than any other person on that aircraft, retired from flying in 1981 and entered a Benedictine monastery. She became a nun, taking religious vows and withdrawing from the public world into the structured life of a contemplative community. She spent nearly 50 years not talking about the case, not giving interviews, not engaging with the enormous industry of Cooper investigation, and Cooper theorizing, and Cooper mythology that grew up around the event she had witnessed firsthand. The Cooper researcher community developed a specific obsession with Tina Mucklow. She had been his closest companion for the duration of the hijacking. She had sat beside him for hours. She had looked at his face, heard his voice, been in proximity to whatever he was, his mannerisms, his effects, the small observable things that an experienced investigator might have been able to build something from. For the community of Cooper enthusiasts, she represented a source of information that had never been fully tapped, and her silence generated over the decades a mythology of its own. Journalist Jeffrey Gray, who wrote what became the definitive popular account of the Cooper case, described in his book the desperation he felt trying to reach her. He had sent letters, he had left messages, he had sat outside the monastery, he had sent what he described as telepathic messages, mental beams aimed at her phone. She did not respond. When she finally gave an interview to Rolling Stone, after nearly 50 years of silence, she said something that surprised the reporter. She did not find the Cooper case traumatic. She did not experience it as the defining event of her life in the way the outside world had decided it must be. She had gone back to work within a month of the hijacking. She had been young and resilient and trained for exactly this kind of situation, and she had moved on from it in the way that young people move on from things they do not yet fully understand. What she remembered most clearly after 50 years was his composure. He was never agitated, he never raised his voice. He was courteous to her in a specific way that she found difficult to categorize. Not warm, not cold, just civil, as if they were two people sharing a long flight under unusual circumstances, which was precisely what they were. He had offered her money from the ransom. She had declined politely, He had accepted her refusal with no change in his manner, as if it was a perfectly reasonable response that he had anticipated. "He seemed rather nice," she said. Whatever he was walking into when he stepped out the back of that airplane, the dark and the rain and the 200-mile-an-hour wind and the trees and the cold and the absolute uncertainty of whether the next 30 seconds would produce a survivable landing or an unsurvivable one. He faced it with the same composure he had brought to the airport in Portland that afternoon. The business suit, the loafers, the bourbon and soda. The last thing Tina Mucklow saw was a man walking toward the back of the plane with $200,000 in a canvas bag. Then the tail lurched. Then he was gone. Who was he? The investigation never answered this question, and it is worth assembling what the evidence suggests. Not who he was by name, but what kind of person the available facts point toward. He was comfortable on a commercial aircraft. Florence Schaffner, who received his note, initially assumed it was a phone number, which means her first impression of him was of someone so ordinary that a note from him seemed like an unremarkable social overture. He did not register as unusual. He ordered a drink, lit a cigarette, sat quietly. This is either natural composure or practiced composure, and either way, it produced exactly the invisibility he needed. He knew the Boeing 727. He asked about the rear staircase at the ticket counter before he boarded. This information was not common knowledge. It was something you needed to either work in aviation or research deliberately to know. Whether his familiarity came from professional experience in the industry or from careful preparation before the hijacking could not be determined. Most investigators favored some connection to aviation or military experience, given the specificity of his knowledge. He was calm under pressure in the specific way of someone who is executing a plan. Every crew member who interacted with him described the same quality, not the forced calm of a man suppressing fear, but the flat evenness of someone who has already processed the risk and made peace with it. Tina Mucklow found him courteous. Captain Scott found him businesslike. Nobody found him erratic. He was going through a sequence of events he had prepared, and the preparation was holding. He tried to tip the flight attendants. This detail appears in multiple accounts and was remembered precisely because it was incongruous. A man conducting a hijacking who, in the middle of it, attempts to compensate the service staff. It says something about his character that is difficult to interpret. Genuine courtesy, performance of courtesy, or a specific distinction in his mind between the airline as a target and the women in blue uniforms as people who were simply on duty. Whatever it meant, it produced an impression that survived in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. He chose a $20 denomination for the ransom. $200,000 in 20s is 10,000 bills. Heavy, bulky, a significant physical mass to carry. Larger bills would have been lighter and easier to handle. The choice of 20s is usually interpreted as deliberate, as a recognition that large bills are more traceable and more difficult to spend without attracting attention. He jumped at night, in November, over a forest, in a business suit with an unsteerable parachute. If this was a survival plan, it was an improbable one. The FBI's conclusion that he died follows directly from these conditions. A man who intended to walk out of the forest would have worn boots, would have worn warm clothing, would have chosen the steerable parachute that was available to him and that he left behind on the aircraft. The man who actually jumped either made a series of significant errors or had reasons for his choices that the investigation never uncovered, or did not expect to walk out of the forest at all. This is the reading of the case that nobody quite says explicitly, that D.B. Cooper may have been a man who had decided he was done, who wanted to leave on his own terms, with $200,000 in his hands and the dark below him, and the whole complicated question of who he was and what he had been resolved in the only way he could resolve it. A man making a final exit in a business suit in the manner he had chosen. If that is what happened, if the forest was the destination and not the obstacle, then the FBI's conclusion that he died is correct. And the question of his identity is the question of a dead man's past, resolvable only if someone who knew him puts the pieces together and comes forward. Nobody has. The name D.B. Cooper came from a journalist error. On the night of the hijacking, when the United Press International wire service moved the first story, the man's name was listed as D.B. Cooper rather than Dan Cooper. The FBI corrected the error the following morning. The correction was too late. The name had traveled and the name stayed, because D.B. Cooper fit the mystery in a way that Dan Cooper did not. The initials suggested everything unknown, the middle name that nobody knew, the middle of the man that nobody knew, the middle of the whole story that nobody had access to. The mythology of D.B. Cooper is inseparable from the specific quality of what he did and how he did it. He did not hurt anyone. He was polite to the crew. He released the passengers. He took only what he had asked for. He disappeared so completely that the most sophisticated law enforcement agency in the world over 45 years could not find him, could not even confirm whether he was alive or dead. And in that disappearance he became something that American popular culture does not produce very often. An outlaw that the public genuinely liked. Films were made about him. Books were written about him. Television shows referenced him. The character Don Draper on Mad Men generated so much speculation in the final seasons of the show that he might be revealed as D.B. Cooper, that the show's creator addressed it publicly and denied it. A convention of Cooper enthusiasts called CooperCon meets annually in various cities, drawing people from across the country who have been researching the case for decades and who share theories and evidence and the specific camaraderie of people who have spent years on the same question. The town of Ariel, Washington, holds an annual D.B. Cooper Days event, a festival in a community that may or may not be in the general area where he landed, that may or may not be near where he died, that has embraced his legend with the practical enthusiasm of a small town that has discovered it as a tourist attraction. The event draws crowds. People come from far away to stand in the general vicinity of where an unidentified man in a business suit may or may not have landed in 1971 after jumping from a commercial aircraft. This is the specific quality of the Cooper mythology. It is built around an absence. There is no confirmed ending, no body, no prison term, no conviction. There is only the question, which has remained the question for over 50 years, and which the FBI's suspension of the active investigation in 2016 did not resolve, and which no subsequent development has resolved. Who was he? A military veteran with parachute training, using skills from a previous life to execute a plan he had spent months preparing. A desperate man who had nothing to lose and was willing to accept whatever the forest gave him. Someone who had thought through the logistics carefully, but had made an error in the parachute selection that cost him his life. Someone who had made no error, who had survived and walked out of the forest and spent the rest of his life as someone else entirely, somewhere in a country that never found him. The serial numbers on the remaining bills are still in a database, waiting for the moment that someone tries to spend one. Nobody ever has. The serial numbers on the bills were recorded before the ransom was assembled and have been in an FBI database ever since. Every bill in that package, all $10,020 notes, has a serial number that would trigger an alert if it passed through a bank. In 1971, in 1980, in 2000, in 2024, any of those bills deposited at any bank in the country would have been flagged. Nobody has ever deposited one. This is either because Cooper died with the money before he could spend it, or because Cooper was smart enough to understand that the bills were useless through any normal financial channel. If he survived with $200,000 that he could not safely spend, could not deposit, could not trade without risk. A fortune in paper that was more dangerous than useful. Some researchers suggest this is consistent with a man who was making a statement rather than a plan. You don't need to spend the money if the point was never the money. You need the money to make the airline and the FBI and the country take you seriously. You need the money as proof of concept. You need the money as the object in your hands when you step out the back of the plane. Whether you need it after that is a different question. The $5,800 found at Tenor Bar in 1980 were deteriorated, decomposing, coming apart, held together by rubber bands that had outlasted the paper they were binding. Forensic analysis placed their immersion in water, not in November 1971, but the following spring, which meant they had spent several months somewhere else before entering the river system. Where that somewhere else was a cache site, a body, a place where the money had been buried and uncovered by spring runoff, was never determined. Investigators who believed Cooper died argued that the money was carried by the spring flood from wherever he landed to the river, over months, along the watershed. Investigators who believed he survived argued that the money might represent a small amount of the ransom that was damaged or lost, while the rest remained in Cooper's possession or was disposed of in a way that left no trace. Both arguments are internally consistent. Neither can be confirmed. The remaining money, $194,000, give or take, is still somewhere, in the ground, in a river, in a safe deposit box under a false name, in a landfill, decomposed beyond recognition, converted into something unrecognizable by 50 years of oxidation and moisture and time. It exists somewhere in the physical world. It has serial numbers. It has not appeared. If it appeared tomorrow, if someone dug up a waterproof container in a forest in southwest Washington and found $94,000 in rubber-banded bundles of 20s, the serial numbers matching, the investigation would reopen. Nobody expects this. Nobody has stopped expecting it either. A man paid $20 in cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. He carried a briefcase that may or may not have contained a bomb. He was polite to the crew, paid for his drinks, and tried to tip the flight attendants. He specified an aircraft type at the ticket counter in a way that suggested he knew exactly what he needed. He waited calmly for 2 hours while the ransom was assembled. He released 35 passengers who had nothing to do with what he was doing. He kept the crew because he needed the aircraft to fly. He took the money, chose a parachute, and walked to the back of the plane. He looked at whatever was behind him, the cabin, the seat where he had been sitting, the flight attendant who had been his companion for several hours and who he would never see again. And he went through the door. No one watched him fall. No one found him when he landed. No one has found him since. The FAA, in the months after the hijacking, required a small modification to all Boeing 727 aircraft, a mechanical lock operated from the cockpit that prevented the aft staircase from being lowered while the aircraft was in flight. It was a simple device. It addressed a specific vulnerability that one man had exploited one time, and that no one had thought to address before because no one had thought to exploit it. They named it the Cooper vein. That is the only confirmed physical legacy of D.B. Cooper. Not a body, not a conviction, not a name, not a confession. A small metal component on the tail of every Boeing 727 that flew after 1972, named after a man no one could identify, preventing an escape that no one has attempted again. He paid $20 for a one-way ticket. He got a permanent place in aviation history and a mechanical component named after him. He got into the dark over southwest Washington with $200,000, and the dark kept him. Dan Cooper jumped. Nobody has seen him since. On November 24, 1971, a man who gave a false name bought a ticket with cash for a routine commuter flight. He was polite and composed throughout an event that most people would find terrifying. He specified the exact aircraft type before he boarded, which told him exactly how he was going to leave. He asked for an amount of money that was large enough to be meaningful, but small enough to be assembled quickly. He chose his parachute, or chose poorly, depending on your interpretation. He walked to the back of a Boeing 727 at 8,000 feet over the forests of southwest Washington and stepped into the dark. He was not found. He is not in prison. Nobody knows if he is alive. The aft staircase bears his name. 9 years after he jumped, a child found 3 bundles of his money in a riverbank and immediately knew, somehow, that the crumbling bills in the sand were something important. Brian Ingram grew up. He sold some of the bills. He kept others. He is a grandfather now. He still doesn't know who put the money in the river. Nobody does. Dan Cooper walked up to a ticket counter with $20 in his pocket and became the most famous mystery in the history of American aviation. And then he jumped, and that was the last anyone saw of him.